Hello, darlings. Welcome back to the Gentleman Psychic. I am your host, your MC, your master of ceremonies, Richard Lale Lillard. Richard Lale is one name. Richard Lale is not two names. So, happy Friday to you, my loves. And I'm going to go ahead and share this so that everyone can see that I'm on. And then the clock is going to go off here in just a few minutes. So that'll be good. We'll start when the clock goes off, but I will go over here and share it to the Book of Faces, as I like to say. I will share this now. Copy the link. I really need to get under that restream thing. I'm kicking and screaming into the 21st century. Kicking and screaming, as they say. Um, join me live for more of War of the Worlds. And post that one. And then I will share it to the other one. Hello, Dave. Good evening. Mary Jane. Good evening. Nix. Good evening. Hello to everyone who is not there right now, but everyone that I don't see, I will, I'm sure. Let me just share this over here to the other page. Share to a page. And done. Okay. So hello, everybody. Good to see you. Good to have you. I need to figure out how to transfer the photos again from my phone back to my computer because I would like to show you the War of the Worlds, which is the painting I did for my tarot deck. And I'm going to let the clock go off. It's almost there. I'll let the clock go off. It is right at the 10 p.m. mark by the computer, but I will let the clock go so that it doesn't interrupt right in the middle. And also, we'll give a little bit of time for people to join us. So, again, for those of you who are just joining me, thank you for joining me. I am your host, your MC, your master of ceremonies. My first name is Richard Lale. Richard Lale is one name, it is not two names. If I were just Richard, I'd be a dick. So there we are with that one. And you can find me on all of my Instagrams, the Gentleman Psychic on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of the above. Find me there, and I'm so glad to have you. I am really getting into this book. It has been so much fun, so well written for a book of the 19th century where we were just getting into sort of the modern age and what may lie in the future. So, one more minute, 30 seconds maybe. So I want to tell you a little bit about, hello, Joan. Good evening. Lovely to have you. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm wearing. So this waistcoat I'm wearing it on the outside because you couldn't see it on the inside. So this is, it's silk velvet. It's 19th century Ottoman Empire. And I thought that I would, bonjour, Richard, bonjour. I thought today that I would add in some of my pearls, clutch the pearls. I know there is a new trend where men are wearing pearls, but I prefer when men wear pearls with everything else because then it looks like a Maharaja, and that I prefer to a surfer guy. Here we go, and the clock strikes 10. Hello, Isaac. Hello, welcome. So here we go, my loves. I am, again, so grateful that you are here to enjoy the War of the Worlds with me. We left off with our hero. He was back in his house and everything was set ablaze. He had encountered a soldier, and we pick up with chapter 12. Chapter 12. What I saw of the destruction of Weybridge and Shepperton. As the dawn grew brighter, we withdrew from the window from which we had watched the Martians, and we went very quietly downstairs. The artilleryman agreed with me that the house was no place to stay in. He proposed, he said, to make his way Londonward, and thence rejoin his battery, number 12, of the House Artillery. My plan was return at once to Leatherhead, and so greatly had the strength of the Martians impressed me that I had determined to take my wife to Newhaven, and go with her out of the country forthwith, for I already perceived clearly that the country about London must inevitably be the scene of a disastrous struggle. Before such creatures as these could be destroyed. Between us and Leatherhead, however, lay the third cylinder, with its guarding giants. Had I been alone, I think I should have taken my chance and struck across country, but the artilleryman dissuaded me. It's no kindness to the right sort of wife, he said, to make her a widow, and in the end I agreed to go with him under the cover of the woods, northward, as far as the street of Cobham, before I parted with him. Thence I would make a big detour by Epsom to reach Leatherhead. I should have started at once, but my companion had been in active service, and he knew better than that. He made me ransack the house for a flask, which he filled with whiskey, and we lined every available pocket with packets of biscuits and slices of meat. Then we crept out of the house and ran as quickly as we could down the ill-made road by which I had come overnight. The houses seemed deserted. In the road lay a group of 3 charred bodies close together, struck dead by the heat ray, and here and there were things that people had dropped: a clock, a slipper, a silver spoon, and the like poor valuables. At the corner turning up towards the post office, a little cart filled with boxes and furniture, and horseless, heeled over on a broken wheel. A cash box had been hastily smashed open and thrown under the debris. Except the lodge at the orphanage, which was still on fire, none of the houses had suffered very greatly here. The heat ray had shaved the chimney tops and passed, yet, save ourselves, there did not seem to be a living soul on Maybury Hill. The majority of the inhabitants had escaped, I suppose, by the way of the old working road, the road I had taken when I drove to Leatherhead, or they had hidden. We went down the lane by the body of a man in black, sodden now from the overnight hail, and broke into the woods at the foot of the hill. We pushed through these towards the railway without meeting a soul. The woods across the line were but the scarred and blackened ruins of woods. For the most part, the trees had fallen, but a certain proportion stood still, dismal grey stems with dark brown foliage instead of green. On our side, the fire had done no more than scorch the nearer trees. It had failed to secure its footing. In one place, the woodman had been at work on Saturday. Trees felled and freshly trimmed lay in clearing with heaps of sawdust by the sawing machine and its engine. Hard by was a temporary hut, deserted. There was not a breath of wind this morning, and everything was stagnant, strangely still. Even the birds were hushed, and as we hurried along, I and the artilleryman talked in whispers and looked now and again over our shoulders. Once or twice we stopped to listen. After a time we drew near the road, and as we did so we heard the clatter of hoofs and saw through the tree stems 3 cavalry soldiers riding slowly towards Woking. He hailed them, and they halted while we hurried, hussars with a stand like theodolite, which the artilleryman told me was a heliograph. "You are the first men I've seen coming this way this morning," said the lieutenant. "What's brewing?" His voice and face were eager. The men behind him stared curiously. The artilleryman jumped down the bank into the road and saluted. "Gun destroyed last night, sir. Have been hiding, trying to rejoin battery, sir. You'll come in sight of the Martians, I expect, about half a mile along this road." "What the dickens are they like?" asked the lieutenant. "Giants in armor, sir. 100 feet high, 3 legs, and a body like aluminum, which a mighty great head in a hood, sir." "Get out," said the lieutenant. "What confounded nonsense! You'll see, sir, they carry a kind of box, sir, that shoots fire and strikes you dead." "What do you mean, a gun?" "No, sir," said the artilleryman, began a vivid account of the heat ray. Halfway through, the lieutenant interrupted him and looked up at me. I was still standing on the bank by the side of the road. "It's perfectly true," I said. "Well," said the lieutenant, "I suppose it's my business to see it too. Look here," to the artilleryman, "we're detailed here clearing people out of their houses. You'd better get along and report yourself to the Brigadier General Marvin, and tell him all you know. He's at Weybridge. Know the way?" "I do," I said, and he turned his horse southward again. "Half a mile, you say?" said he. "At most," I answered, and pointed over the treetops southward. He thanked me and rode on, and we saw them no more. Farther along, we came upon a group of 3 women and 2 children in the road, busy clearing out laborer's cottage. They had got hold of a little hand truck and were piling it up with unclean-looking bundles and shabby furniture. They were all too assiduously engaged to talk to us as we passed. By Byfleet Station, we emerged from the pine trees and found the country calm and peaceful under the morning sunlight. We were far beyond the range of the heat rays here, and had it not been for the silent desertion of some of the houses, the stirring movement of packing in others, and the knot of soldiers standing on the bridge over the railway and staring down the line towards Woking, the day would have seemed very like any other Sunday. Several farm wagons and carts were moving creakily along the road to Addleston, and suddenly, through the gate of a field, we saw across a stretch of flat meadow 6 12-pounders standing neatly at equal distance. The ammunition wagons were at a business-like distance. The men stood almost as if under inspection. "That's good," said I. "They'll get one fair shot at any rate." The artilleryman hesitated at the gate. "I shall go on," he said. Farther on towards Weybridge, just over the bridge, there were a number of men in white fatigue jackets, throwing up long rampart and more guns behind. "It's bows and arrows against the lightning anyhow," said the artilleryman. "They haven't seen that fire beam yet." The officers, who were not actively engaged, stood and stared over the treetop southwestward, and the men digging would stop every now and again to stare in the same direction. Byfleet was in a tumult, people packing, and a score of hussars, some of them dismounted, some on horseback, were hunting them out. 3 or 4 black government wagons, with crosses in white circles, and an old omnibus, among other vehicles, were being loaded in the village street. There were scores of people, most of them sufficiently sabbatical to have assumed their best clothes. The soldiers were having the greatest difficulty in making them realize the gravity of their position. We saw one shriveled old fellow with huge box and a score or more of flower pots containing orchids, angrily expostulating with the corporal who would leave them behind. I stopped and gripped his arm. "Do you know what's over there?" I said, pointing at the pine tops that hid the Martians. "Ah," said he, turning. "I was explaining these are valuable." "Death," I shouted. "Death is coming, death." And leaving him to digest that if he could, I hurried on after the artilleryman. At the corner, I looked back. The soldier had left him, and he was still standing by his box with his by his box with the pots of orchids on the lid of it, and staring vaguely over the trees. No one in Weybridge could tell us where the headquarters were established. The whole place was in such confusion as I had never seen in any town before. Carts, carriages everywhere, the most astonishing miscellany of conveyances and horseflesh. The respectable inhabitants of the place, men in golf and boating costumes, wives, prettily dressed, were packing riverside loafers, energetically helping. Children excited and, for the most part, highly delighted at this astonishing variation of their Sunday experiences. In the midst of all, the worthy vicar was very pluckily holding an early celebration, and his bell was jangling out above the excitement. I and the artilleryman, seated on the step of the drinking fountain, made a very passable meal upon what we had brought with us. Patrols of soldiers here, no longer hussars, but grenadiers in white, were warning people to move now or take refuge in their cellars as soon as the firing began. We saw as we crossed the railway bridge that a growing crowd of people had assembled in about the railway station, and the swarming platform was piled with boxes and packages. The ordinary traffic had been stopped, I believe, in order to allow the passage of troops and guns to Chestersea. And I have heard since that a savage struggle occurred for places in these special trains that were put on at a later hour. We remained at Weybridge until midday, and at that hour we found ourselves at the place near Shepperton Lock, where the Wey and the Thames join. Part of the time we spent helping two old women to pack a little cart. The Wey has a treble mouth, and this point boats are to be hired, and there was a ferry across the river. On the Shepperton side was an inn with a lawn, and beyond that the tower of Shepperton Church. It has been replaced by a spire rose above the trees. Here we found an excited and noisy crowd of fugitives. As yet the flight had not grown to a panic. But there were already far more people than all the boats going to and fro could enable to cross. People came panting along under heavy burdens. One husband and wife were even carrying a small outhouse door between them, with some of their household goods piled thereon. One man told us he meant to try to get away from Shepperton Station. There was a lot of shouting, and one man was even jesting. The idea people seemed to have here was that the Martians were simply formidable human beings who might attack and sack the town, to be certainly destroyed in the end. Every now and then people would glance nervously across the way at the meadows towards Chestersea, but everything over there was still. Across the Thames, except just where the boats landed, everything was quiet. In vivid contrast with Surreyside, the people who landed there from boats went tramping off down the lane. The big ferry boat had just made a journey. 3 or 4 soldiers stood on the lawn of the inn, staring and jesting at the fugitives without offering to help. The inn was closed, as it was now within prohibited hours. "What's that?" cried a boatman. "And shut up, you fool," said a man near me to a yelping dog. Then the sound came again, this time from the direction of Chestersea. A muffled thud, the sound of a gun. The fighting was beginning. Almost immediately, unseen batteries across the river to our right, unseen because of the trees, took up the chorus, firing heavily one after the other. A woman screamed. Everyone stood, arrested by the sudden stir of battle. Near us, and yet invisible to us, nothing was to be seen save flat meadows, cows feeding unconcernedly for the most part, and silvery pollard windows motionless in the warm sunlight. "The soldiers'll stop 'em," said a woman beside me doubtfully. A haziness rose over the top of the trees. Then suddenly we saw a rush of smoke far away up the river, a puff of smoke that jerked up into the air and hung, and forthwith the ground heaved underfoot, and a heavy explosion shook the air, smashing 2 or 3 windows in houses near, and leaving us astonished. "Here they are!" shouted a man in a blue jersey. "Yonder, do you see 'em? Yonder!" Quickly, one after the other, 1, 2, 3, 4, of the armored Martians appeared, far away over the little trees, across the flat meadows that stretched toward Chestersea, and striding hurriedly towards the river. Little cowled figures they seemed at first, going with rolling motion and as fast as flying birds. Then, advancing obliquely toward us, came a fifth. Their armored bodies glittered in the sun as they swept swiftly forward upon the guns, growing rapidly larger as they drew nearer. One of the extreme left, the remotest, that is, flourished a huge case high in the air, and ghostly, terrible heat ray I had already seen on Friday night smote towards Chestersea and struck the town. At sight of these strange, swift, and terrible creatures, the crowd near the water's edge seemed to me to be for a moment horror-struck. There was no screaming or shouting, but silence. Then a hoarse murmur and a movement of feet. A splashing from the water. A man, too frightened to drop the portmanteau he carried on his shoulder, swung round and sent me staggering with a blow from the corner of his burden. A woman thrust at me with her hand and rushed past me. I turned with the rush of the people, but I was not too terrified for thought. The terrible heat ray was, in my mind, to get under water. That was it. "Get under water," I shouted, unheeded. I faced about again and rushed toward the approaching Martian, rushed right down the gravelly beach and headlong into the water. Others did the same. A boatload of people, putting back, came leaping out as I rushed past. The stones under my feet were muddy and slippery, and the river was so low that I ran perhaps 20 feet, scarcely waist deep. Then, as the Martian towered overhead, scarcely a couple of 100 yards away, I flung myself forward under the surface. The splashes of people in the boats leaping into the river sounded like thunderclaps in my ears. People were landing hastily on both sides of the river. But the Martian machine took no more notice for the moment of the people running this way and that than a man would of the confusion of ants in a nest against which his foot has kicked. When half suffocated, I raised my head above water. The Martian's hood pointed at the batteries that were still firing across the river, and as it advanced, it swung loose what must have been a generator of heat ray. In another moment, it was on the bank, and in a stride wading halfway across, the knees of its foremost legs bent at farther bank, and in another moment it had raised itself to its full height again. Close to the village of Shepperton, forthwith the 6 guns, which, unknown to any one on the right bank, had been hidden behind the outskirts of that village, fired simultaneously. The sudden near concussion, the last close upon the first, made my heart jump. The monster was already raising the case, generating the heat ray as the first shell burst 6 yards above the hood. I gave a cry of astonishment. I saw and thought nothing of the other 4 Martian monsters. My attention was riveted upon the nearer incident. Simultaneously, 2 other shells burst in the air near the body as the hood twisted round in time to receive, but not in time to dodge the 4th shell. The shell burst clean in the face of the thing. The hood bulged, flashed, was whirled off a dozen tattered fragments of red flesh and glittering metal. "Hit!" I shouted, with something between a scream and a cheer. I heard answering shouts from the people in the water about me. I could have leaped out of water with that momentary exultation. The decapitated colossus reeled like a drunken giant, but it did not fall over. It recovered its balance by a miracle, and no longer heeded its steps, and with the camera that fired the heat ray, now rigidly upheld. It reeled swiftly upon the Shepperton. The living intelligence, the Martian within the hood, was slain and splashed to the four winds of heaven, and the thing was now but a mere intricate device of metal whirling to destruction. It drove along in a straight line, incapable of guidance. It struck the tower of the Shepperton Church, smashing it down as an impact of battering ram might have done, swerved aside, blundered on, and collapsed with tremendous force into the river out of my sight. A violent explosion shook the air, and a spout of water, steam, mud, and shattered metal shot far up into the sky. As the camera of the heat ray hit the water, the latter had immediately flashed into steam. In another moment, a huge wave, like a muddy tidal bore but almost scaldingly hot, came sweeping round the bend upstream. I saw people struggling shorewards and heard their screams and shouting faintly above the seething and heard roar of the Martian's collapse. For a moment, I heeded nothing of the heat, forgot the patent need of self-preservation. I splashed through the tumultuous water, pushing aside a man in black to do so, until I could see round the bend half a dozen deserted boats pitched aimlessly upon the confusion of the waves. The fallen Martian came into sight downstream, laying across the river, and for the most part submerged. Thick clouds of steam were pouring off the wreckage, and through the tumultuously whirling wisps I could see, intermittently and vaguely, the gigantic limbs churning the water and flinging a splash and spray of mud and froth into the air. The tentacles swayed and struck like living arms, and, save for the helpless purposelessness of these movements, it was as if some wounded thing were struggling for its life. Amid the waves, enormous quantities of ruddy brown fluid were spurting up in noisy jets out of the machine. My attention was diverted from this death flurry by furious yelling, like that of the thing called a siren in our manufacturing towns. A man, knee-deep near the towing path, shouted inaudibly to me and pointed. Looking back, I saw the other Martians advancing with gigantic strides down the riverbank from the direction of Chestersea. The Shepperton guns spoke this time unavailingly. At that, I ducked at once under water and, holding my breath until movement was an agony, blundered painfully ahead under the surface as long as I could. The water was in tumult about me and rapidly growing hotter. Then for a moment I raised my head to take a breath and throw the hair and water from my eyes. The stream was rising and whirling white fog that at first hid the Martians altogether. The noise was deafening. Then I saw them dimly, colossal figures of grey, magnified by the mist. They had passed by me, and two were stooping over the frothing, tumultuous ruins of their comrade. The third and fourth stood beside him in the water, one perhaps 200 yards from me, the other towards Latham. The generators of the heat rays waved high, and the hissing beams smote down his way, and this way and that. The air was full of sound, a deafening and confusing conflict of noises, the clangorous din of the Martians, the crash of falling houses, the thud of trees, fences, sheds flashing into flame, and the crackling and roaring of fire. Dense black smoke was leaping up to mingle with the steam from the river. And as the heat ray went to and fro, Weybridge, its impact was marked by flashes of incandescent white, and gave place to once a smoky dance of lurid flames. The nearer houses still stood intact, awaiting their fate, shadowy, faint, and pallid in the steam, with the fire behind them going to and fro. For a moment, perhaps, I stood there, breast high in the almost boiling water, dumbfounded at my position, hopeless of escape. Through the reek, I could see the people who had been with me in the river, scrambling out the water through the reeds like little frogs, hurrying through grass from the advance of a man, or running to and fro in utter dismay on the towing path Then suddenly the white flashes of heat ray came leaping towards me. The houses caved in as they dissolved at its touch, and darted out flames. The trees changed to fire with a roar. The ray flickered up and down the towing path, licking off people who ran this way and that, and came down to the water's edge not 50 yards from where I stood. It swept across the river to Shepperton, and the water in its track rose in a boiling wheel crested with steam. I turned shoreward. In another moment, the huge wave, well nigh at the boiling point, had rushed upon me. I screamed aloud and, scalded, half blinded, agonized, I staggered through the leaping, hissing water toward the shore. Had my foot stumbled, it would have been the end. I fell helplessly, in full sight of the Martians upon the broad, bare, gravelly spit that runs down to mark the angle of the Wey and the Thames. I expected nothing but death. I have a dim memory of the foot of a Martian coming down within a score of yards of my head, driving straight into a loose gravel, whirling its way, and lifting again for a long suspense, and then the four carrying the debris of their comrade between them, now clear and then presently faint through a veil of smoke, receding intermittently, and, as it seemed to me, across a vast space of the river and meadow. Then, very slowly, I realized that by a miracle, I had escaped. Chapter 13. Chapter 13. How I fell in with the curate. After getting this sudden lesson in the power of terrestrial weapons, the Martians retreated to their original position upon Horsell Common, and in their haste, and encumbered with the debris of their smashed companion, they no doubt overlooked many such a stray and negligible victim as myself. Had they left their comrade and pushed on forthwith, there was nothing at that time between them and London but batteries of 12-pounder guns, and they would certainly have reached the capital in advance of the tidings of their approach. As sudden, dreadful, and destructive their advent would have been as the earthquake that destroyed Lisbon a century ago. But they were in no hurry. Cylinder followed cylinder on its interplanetary flight. Every 24 hours brought them reinforcement. And meanwhile, the military and naval authorities, now fully alive to the tremendous power of their antagonists, worked with furious energy. Every minute, a fresh gun came into position until, before twilight, every copse, every row of suburban villas on the hilly slopes about Kingston, and Richmond masked an expectant black muzzle. And though the charred and desolated area, perhaps 20 square miles altogether, that encircled the Martian encampment on Horsell Common, through charred and ruined villages among the green trees, through the blackened and smoking arcades that had been but a day ago pine spinies, crawled out the devoted scouts with the heliographs that were presently to warn the gunners of the Martians' approach. But the Martians now understood our command of artillery and the danger of human proximity, and not a man ventured within a mile of either cylinder, save at the price of his life. It would seem these giants spent the earlier part of the afternoon in going to and fro, transferring everything from the second and third cylinders, the second in Addlestone Gulf links, and the third to Pryford, to their original pit on Horsell Common. Over that, above the blackened heather and ruined buildings that stretched far and wide, stood one as a sentinel, while the rest abandoned their vast fighting machines and descended into the pit. They were hard at work there far into the night, and the towering pillar of dense green smoke that rose therefrom could be seen from the hills about Miro, and even, it said, from Banstead and Epsom Downs. And while the Martians behind me were thus preparing for their next sally, and in front of me the humanity gathered for the battle, I made my way with infinite pains and labour from the fire and smoke of burning Weybridge towards London. I saw an abandoned boat, very small and remote, drifting downstream, and throwing off the most of my sudden clothes, I went after it. I gained it, and so escaped out of that destruction. There were no oars in the boat, but I contrived to paddle as well as my parboiled hands would allow, down the river toward Halliford and Walton, going very tediously and continually looking behind me. As you may well understand, I followed the river because I considered that the water gave me the best chance of escape should these giants return. The hot water from the Martians' overthrow drifted downstream with me, so that for the best part of a mile I could see a little of either bank. Once, however, I made out a string of black figures hurrying across the meadows from the direction of Weybridge. Halliford, it seemed, was deserted, and several of the houses facing the river were on fire. It was strange to see the place quiet and tranquil, quite desolate under the hot blue sky, with the smoke and little threads of flame going straight up into the heat of the afternoon. Never before had I seen houses burning without the accompaniment of an obstructive crowd. A little further on the dry reeds up the bank were smoking and glowing, and a line of fire inland was marching steadily across a late field of hay. For some time I drifted, so painful and weary was I after the violence I had been through, and so intense the heat upon the water. Then my fears got the better of me again, and I resumed my paddling. The sun scorched my bare back. At last, as the bridge at Walton was coming into sight round the bend, my fever and faintness overcame my fears, and I landed on the bend. My and I landed on Middlesex Bank and lay down, deadly sick amid the long grass. I suppose the time was then about 4 or 5 o'clock. I got up presently, walked perhaps a mile without meeting a soul, and then lay down again in the shadow of a hedge. I seem to remember talking wanderingly to myself during the last spurt. I was also very thirsty and bitterly regretful I had drunk no more water. It is a curious thing that I felt angry with my wife. I cannot account for it, but my impotent desire to reach Leatherhead worried me excessively. I do not clearly remember the arrival of the curate, so that probably I dozed. I became aware of him as a seated figure in soot-smudged shirt sleeves, and with his upturned, clean-shaven face, staring at a faint flickering that danced over the sky. The sky, what is called a mackerel sky, rose in rows of faint down plumes of cloud, just tinted with the midsummer sunset. I sat up, and at the rustle of my motion, he looked at me quickly. "Have you any water?" I asked abruptly. He shook his head. "You gave me asking for water for the last hour," he said. "Oh, you've been asking for water for the last hour," he said. For a moment we were silent, taking stock of each other. I dare he found me a strange enough figure, naked, save for my water-soaked trousers and socks, scalded, and my face and shoulders blackened by smoke. His face was fair weakness. His chin retreated, and his hair lay in crisp, almost flaxen curls on his low forehead. His eyes were rather large, pale blue, and blankly staring. He spoke abruptly, looking vacantly from me. "What does it mean?" he said. "What do those things mean?" I stared at him and made no answer. He extended a thin white hand and spoke in almost complaining tone. "Why are those things permitted? What sins have we done? The morning service was over. I was walking through the roads to clear my brain for the afternoon, and then fire, earthquake, death, as if it were Sodom and Gomorrah. All our work undone, all the work. What are these Martians?" "What are we?" I answered, clearing my throat. He gripped his knee and turned to look at me again. For half a minute, perhaps, he stared silently. I was walking through the roads to clear my brain, he said, and suddenly fire, earthquake, death. He relapsed into silence, with his chin now sunken almost to his knees. Presently he began waving his hand. All the work, all the Sunday schools, what have we done? What has Weybridge done? Everything gone, everything destroyed. The church, we rebuilt it only 3 years ago, gone, swept out of existence. And why? Another pause, and he broke out again like one demented. The smoke of a burning goeth up for ever and ever, he shouted. His eyes flamed, and he pointed a lean finger in the direction of Weybridge. By this time, I was beginning to take his measure. The tremendous tragedy in which he had been involved, it was evident he was a fugitive from Weybridge, had driven him to the very verge of his reason. Are we far from Sunbury? I said, in a matter-of-fact tone. What are we to do? He asked. Are these creatures everywhere? Has the earth been given over to them? Are we far from Sunbury? Why, only this morning I officiated at early celebration. Things have changed, I said quickly. You must keep your head. There is still hope. Hope! Yes, plentiful hope for all this destruction. I began to explain my view of our position. He listened at first, but as I went on, the interest dawning in his eyes gave place to the former stare, and his regard wandered from me. This must be the beginning of the end, he said, interrupting me. The end, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when men shall call upon the mountains and the rocks to fall upon them and hide them from the face of him that sitteth upon the throne. I began to understand the position. I ceased my labored reasoning, struggled to my feet, and, standing over him, laid my hand on his shoulder. Be a man, said I. You are scared out of your wits. What good is religion if it collapses under calamity? Think of what earthquakes and floods, wars and volcanoes have done before two men. Did you think God had exempted Weybridge? He's not an insurance agent. For a time he sat in blank silence. But how can we escape? He asked suddenly. They're invulnerable. They are pitiless. Neither the one nor perhaps the other, I answered, and the mightier they are, the more sane and wary should we be. One of them was killed yonder not 3 hours ago. Killed, he said, staring about him. How can God's ministers be killed? I saw it happen. I proceeded to tell him, we have chanced to come in for the thick of it, said I, and that is all. What is that flicker in the sky? He asked abruptly. I told him it was the heliograph signaling, that it was the sign of the human help and effort in the sky. We are in the midst of it, I said, quiet as it is. That flicker in the sky tells of the gathering storm. Yonder, I take it, are the Martians, and Londonward, where those hills rise about Richmond and Kingston, and the trees give cover. Earthworks are being thrown up and guns are being placed. Presently the Martians will be coming this way again. And as I spoke, he sprang to his feet and stopped me by a gesture. Shh, listen, he said. From beyond the low hills across the water came the dull resonance of distant guns and remote weird crying. Then everything was still. A cockchafer came droning over the bridge and past us. High in the west, the crescent moon hung faint and pale above the smoke of Weybridge and Shepperton and the hot, still splendor of the sunset. We had better follow this path, I said, northward. Chapter 14, in London. My younger brother was in London when the Martians fell on Woking. He was a medical student, working for an imminent examination, and he heard nothing of the arrival until Sunday morning. The morning papers on Saturday contained, in addition to lengthy special articles on the planet Mars, on life in the planets, and so forth, a brief and vaguely worded telegram, all the more striking for its brevity. The Martians, alarmed by the approach of a crowd, had killed a number of people with quick-firing gun. So the story ran. The telegram concluded with words, "Formidable as they seem to be, the Martians have not moved from the pit into which they have fallen, and indeed seem incapable of doing so. Probably this is due to the relative strength of the Earth's gravitational energy." On that last text, their writer expanded very comfortingly. Of course, all the students in the Kramer's biology class, to which my brother went that day, were intensely interested, but there were no signs of any unusual excitement in the streets. The afternoon papers puffed scraps of news under big headlines. They had nothing to tell beyond the movements of troops about the common and the burning of the pine woods. In an extra special edition, announced the bare fact of the interruption of the telegraphic communication. This was nothing to be due to the falling of burning pine trees across the line. Nothing more of the fighting was known that night, the night of my drive to Leatherhead and back. My brother felt no anxiety about us, as he knew from the description in the papers that the cylinder was a good 2 miles from my house. He made up his mind to run down that night to me, in order, as he says, to see things before they were killed. He dispatched a telegram, which never reached me, about 4 o'clock, and spent the evening at a music hall. In London, also on Saturday night, there was a thunderstorm, and my brother reached Waterloo in a cab. On the platform from which the midnight train usually starts, he learned after some waiting that an accident prevented trains from reaching Woking that night. The nature of the accident he could not ascertain. Indeed, the railway authorities did not know clearly at the time. There was very little excitement at the station, as the officials, failing to realize that anything further than a breakdown between Byfleet and Woking Junction had occurred, were running the theatre trains, which usually passed through Woking, round by Virginia Water or Guildford. They were busy making the necessary arrangements to alter the route of Southampton to Portsmouth Sunday League excursions. A nocturnal newspaper reporter, mistaking my brother for the traffic manager, to whom he bears a slight resemblance, waylaid and tried to interview him. Few people, excepting the railway officials, connected the breakdown with the Martians. I have read, in another account of these events, that on Sunday morning all London was electrified by the news of Woking. As a matter of fact, there was nothing to justify that very extravagant phrase. Plenty of Londoners did not hear the Martians until the panic of Monday morning. Those who did took some time to realize all that the hastily worded telegrams in the Sunday papers conveyed. The majority of these people in London do not read Sunday papers. The habit of personal security, moreover, is so deeply fixed in the Londoner's mind, and startling intelligence so much a matter of course in the papers, that they could read without any personal tremors. About 7 o'clock last night, the Martians came out of the cylinder and, moving about under the armor of metallic shields, have completely wrecked Woking Station with the adjacent houses, and massacred an entire battalion of the Cardigan Regiment. No details are known. Maxims have been absolutely useless against their armor. The field guns have been disabled by them. Flying hussars have been galloping into Chestersea. The Martians appear to be moving slowly towards Chestersea or Windsor. Great anxiety prevails in West Surrey, and earthworks are being thrown up to check the advance of Londonward. That was how the Sunday Sun put it, and a clever and remarkably prompt handbook article in the Referee compared the affair to a menagerie suddenly let loose in a village. No one in London knew positively of the nature of the armored Martians, and there was still fixed idea that these monsters must be sluggish, crawling, creeping painfully. Such expression occurred in almost all the earlier reports. None of the telegrams could have been written by an eyewitness or their advance. The Sunday papers printed separate editions as further news came to hand, some even in default of it. But there was practically nothing more to tell people until the late afternoon. When the authorities gave the press agencies the news in their possession, it was stated that the people of Walton and Weybridge and all the districts were pouring along the roads Londonward, and that was all. My brother went to church at Foundling Hospital in the morning, still in ignorance of what had happened on the previous night. There he heard allusions made to the invasion and a special prayer for peace. Coming out, he bought a referee. He became alarmed at the news of this and went again to Waterloo Station to find out if communication were restored. The omnibuses, carriages, cyclists, and innumerable people walking in their best clothes seemed scarcely affected by the strange intelligence that the news vendors were disseminating. People were interested, or, if alarmed, alarmed only on account of the local residents. At the station, he heard for the first time that the Windsor and Chestersea lines were now interrupted. The porters told him that several remarkable telegrams had been received in the morning from Bayfleet and Chestersea stations, but that these had abruptly ceased. My brother could get very little precise detail out of them. There's fighting going on about Weybridge was the extent of their information. The train service was now very much disorganized. Quite a number of people who had been expecting friends from places on the southwestern network were standing about the station. One grey-headed old gentleman came and abused the southwestern company bitterly to my brother. It wants showing up, he said. One or two trains came in from Richmond, Putney, and Kingston, containing people who had gone for a day's boating and found the locks closed and feeling a panic in the air. A man in blue and white blazer addressed my brother, full of strange tidings. There's hosts of people driving into Kingston in traps and carts and things with boxes of valuables and all that, he said. They come from Moseley and Weybridge and Walton, and they say there's been guns heard at Chestersea, heavy firing, and that mounted soldiers have told them to get off at once because the Martians are coming. We heard guns firing at Hampton Court Station, but we thought it was thunder. What the dickens does it all mean? The Martians can't get out of their pit, can they? My brother could not tell him. Afterwards, he found that the vague feeling of alarm had spread to the clients of the Underground Railway, and that Sunday excursions began to return from all over the southwestern lung, Barnes, Wimbledon, Richmond Park, Kew, and so forth, at unnaturally early hours, but not a soul had anything more than vague hearsay to tell of. Every one connected with the terminus seemed ill-tempered. About 5 o'clock, the gathering of the crowd in the station was immensely excited by the opening of the line of communication, which is almost invariably closed, between the southeastern and the southwestern stations, and the passage of carriage trucks bearing huge guns and carriages crammed with soldiers. These were the guns that were brought up from Woolwich and Chatham to cover Kingston. There was an exchange of pleasantries. You'll get 'em. We're the beast tamers, and so forth. A little while after that, a squad of police came into the station and began to clear the public off the platforms, and my brother went into the street again. The church bells were ringing for evensong, and a squad of Salvation Army lassies came singing down Waterloo Road. On the bridge, a number of loafers were watching a curious brown scum that came drifting down the stream in patches. The sun was just setting, and the clock tower and the Houses of Parliament rose against one of the most peaceful skies It is possible to imagine a sky of gold, barred with long transverse stripes of reddish-purple cloud. There was a talk of floating body. One of the men there, a reservist, he said he was, told my brother he had seen the heliograph flickering in the west. In Wellington Street, my brother met a couple of sturdy roughs who had just rushed out of Fleet Street with still wet newspapers and staring placards. Dreadful catastrophe, they bawled, one to the other down the Wellington Street. Fighting at Weybridge, full description, repulse of the Martians, London in danger. He had to give 3 pence for a copy of that paper. Then it was, and then only, that he realized something of the full power and terror of these monsters. He learned that they were not merely a handful or small, sluggish creatures, but that they were minds swaying vast mechanical bodies, and that they could move swiftly and smite with such power that even the mightiest guns could not stand against them. They were described as vast, spider-like machines, nearly 100 feet high, capable of the speed of an express train and able to shoot out a beam of intense heat. Masked batteries, chiefly of field guns, and had been planted in the country about Horsell Common, and especially between Woking District and London. 5 of the machines had been seen moving towards the Thames, and one, by a happy chance, had been destroyed. In the other cases the shells had missed, and the batteries had been at once annihilated by the heat rays. Heavy losses of soldiers were mentioned, but the tone of the dispatch was optimistic. The Martians had been repulsed. They were not invulnerable. They had retreated to their triangle of cylinders again. In the circle about Woking, signalers with heliographs were pushing forward upon them from all sides. Guns were in rapid transit from Windsor, Portsmouth, Aldershot, Woolwich, even from the north, among others, long wire guns of 95 tons from Woolwich. Altogether, 116 were in position or being hastily placed, chiefly covering London. Never before in England had there been such a vast or rapid concentration of military material. Any further cylinders that fell, it was hoped, could be destroyed at once by high explosives, which were being rapidly manufactured and distributed. No doubt, ran the report, the situation was of the strangest and gravest description, but the public was exhorted to avoid and discourage panic. No doubt the Martians were strange and terrible in the extreme, but at the outside there could not be more than 20 of them against our millions. The authorities had reason to suppose, from the size of the cylinders, that at the other side there could not be more than 5 in each cylinder, 15 altogether, and one at least was disposed of, perhaps more. The public would be fairly warned of the approach of danger, and elaborate measures were being taken for the protection of the people in the threatened southwestern suburbs. And so, with reiterated assurances of safety of London and the ability of the authorities to cope with the difficulty, this quasi-proclamation closed. This was printed in enormous type on paper so fresh that it was still wet, and there had been no time to add a word of comment. It was curious, my brother said, to see how ruthlessly the usual contents of the paper had been hacked and taken out to give place. All down Wellington Street, people could be seen fluttering out of the pink streets and reading, and the Strand was suddenly noisy with the voices of an army of hawkers. Following these pioneers, men came scrambling off buses to secure copies. Certainly, this news excited people intensely, whatever their previous apathy. The shutters of a map shop in Strand were being taken down, my brother said, and a man in his Sunday raiment, lemon yellow gloves even, was visible inside the window, hastily fastening maps of the Surrey to the glass. Going on along the Strand to Trafalgar Square, the paper in his hand, my brother saw some of the fugitives from West Surrey. There was a man with his wife and 2 boys and some articles of furniture in a cart, such as a green grocers use. He was driving it from the direction of Westminster Bridge, and close behind him came a hay wagon with 5 or 6 respectable-looking people in it, and some boxes and bundles. The faces of these people were haggard, and their entire appearance contrasted conspicuously with the Sabbath-best appearance of the people on the omnibus. People in fashionable clothing peeped at them out of cabs. They stopped at the square, as if undecided which way to take, and finally turned eastward along the Strand. Some way behind these came a man in workday clothes, riding one of those old-fashioned tricycles with a small front wheel. He was dirty and white in the face. My brother turned down Victoria, and we met a number of such people. He had a vague idea that he might see something of me. He noticed an unusual number of police regulating the traffic. Some of the refugees were exchanging news with the people on the omnibuses. One was professing to have seen the Martians, boilers on stilts, I tell you, striding along like men. Most of them were excited and animated by their strange experience. Beyond Victoria, the public houses were doing a lively trade with these arrivals. At all the street corners, groups of people were reading papers, talking excitedly, or staring at these unusual Sunday visitors. They seemed to increase as night drew on, until the roads, my brother said, were like Epsom High Street on a Derby day. My brother addressed several of these fugitives and got unsatisfactory answers from most. None of them could tell him any news of Woking except one man who assured him that Woking had been entirely destroyed on the previous night. I come from Byfleet, he said. A man on a bicycle came through the place in early morning and ran from door to door, warning us to come away. Then came soldiers. He went out to look, and there were clouds of smoke to the south, nothing but smoke, but not a soul coming that way. Then we heard the guns at Chestersea, and the folks coming from Weybridge, so I've locked up my house and come on. At that time, there was a strong feeling in the streets that the authorities were to blame for their incapacity to dispose of the invaders without all this inconvenience. About 8 o'clock, a noise of heavy firing was distinctly audible all over the south of London. My brother could not hear it for the traffic in the main thoroughfares, but by striking through a quiet back street to the river, he was able to distinguish it quite plainly. He walked from Westminster to his apartment near Regent's Park about 2. He was now very anxious on my account and disturbed the evident magnitude of the trouble. His mind was inclined to run, even as mine had run on Saturday, on military details. He thought of all those silent, expectant guns, of the suddenly nomadic countryside. He tried to imagine boilers on stilts, 100 feet high. There were 1 or 2 cartloads of refugees passing along Oxford Street, and several in the Marylebone Road, but so slowly was the news spreading that Regent Street and Portland Place were full of their usual Sunday night promenaders, albeit they talked in groups, and along the edge of Regent's Park there were many silent couples walking out together under the scattered gas lamps, as ever there had been. The night was warm and still, and a little oppressive. The sound of guns continued intermittently, and after midnight there seemed to be a sheet of lightning in the south. He read and reread. One moment, please. We'll finish this chapter and then we'll call it an evening. He read and reread the paper, fearing the worst had happened to me. He was restless, and after supper prowled out again aimlessly. He returned and tried in vain to divert his attention to his examination notes. He went to bed a little after midnight and was awakened from lurid dreams in the small hours of Monday by the sound of door knockers, feet running in the street, distant drumming, and the clamour of bells. Red reflections danced on the ceiling for a moment. He lay astonished, wondering whether day had come or the world had gone mad. Then he jumped out of bed and ran to the window. His room was an attic, and as he thrust his head out, up and down the street, there were dozens of echoes to the noise of the window sash, and heads in every kind of night disarray appeared. Enquiries were being shouted. "They're coming!" bawled a policeman, hammering at the door. "The Martians are coming!" He hurried to the next door. The sound of drumming and trumpeting came from the Albany Street barracks, and every church within earshot was hard at work, killing sleep with a vehement, disorderly tocsin. There was a noise of doors opening, and windows after window in the houses opposite flashed from the darkness into yellow illumination. Up the street came galloping a closed carriage, bursting abruptly into noise at the corner, rising to a clattering climax under the window, and dying away slowly in the distance. Close on the rear of this came a couple of cabs, the forerunners of a long procession of flying vehicles, going for the most part to the Chalk Farm station, where the Northwestern special trains were leading up, instead of coming down the gradient into Euston. For a long time my brother stared out the window in blank astonishment, watching the policemen hammering at door after door and delivering their incomprehensible message. Then the door behind him opened, and the man who lodged across the landing came in, dressed only in shirt, trousers, and slippers, his braces loose about his waist, his hair disordered from his pillow. "What the devil is this?" he asked. "Is it a fire? What a devil of a row!" The both craned their heads out of the window, straining to hear what the policemen were shouting. People were coming out of the side streets and standing in groups at the corners talking. "What the devil's this all about?" said my brother's fellow lodger. My brother answered him vaguely and began to dress, running with each garment to the window in order to miss nothing of the growing excitement. And presently, men selling unnaturally early newspapers came bawling into the street. "London in danger of suffocation. The Kingston and Richmond defences forced. Fearful massacres in the Thames Valley." And all about him in the rooms below, in the houses on each side and across the road, and behind in the park terraces, and in the 100 other streets of that part of Marylebone and Westbourne Park district, and St. Pancras, and westward and northward in Kilburn, and St. John's Wood, and Hampstead, and eastward in Shoreditch, Highbury, and Haggerston, and Hoxton, and indeed through all the vastness of London, from Ealing to East Ham. People were rubbing their eyes and opening their windows to stare out and ask aimless questions, and dressing hastily at the first breath of the coming storm storm of fear blew through the streets. It was the dawn of the Great Panic. London, which had gone to bed on Sunday night oblivious and inert, was awakened in the small hours of Monday morning to a vivid sense of danger. Unable from his window to learn what was happening, my brother went down and out into the street, and just as the sky between the parapets of houses grew pink with the early dawn, the flying people on foot in vehicles grew more numerous every moment. "Black smoke," he heard people crying, and again black smoke. The contagion of such unanimous fear was inevitable. As my brother hesitated on the doorstep, he saw another news vendor approaching, and he got a paper forthwith. The man was running away with the rest and selling his papers for a shilling each as he ran, a grotesque mingling of profit and panic. And from this paper my brother read that catastrophic dispatch of the commander-in-chief. "The Martians are able to discharge enormous clouds of black and poisonous vapor by means of rockets. They have smothered our batteries, destroyed Richmond, Kingston, Wimbledon, and are advancing slowly towards London, destroying everything on the way. It is impossible to stop them. There is no safety from the black smoke, but an instant flight. That was all, but it was enough. The whole population of the great 6 million city was stirring, slipping, running. Presently it would be pouring in mass northward. Black smoke, the voices cried. Fire! The bells of the neighboring church made a jangling tumult. A cart, carelessly driven, smashed amid shrieks and curses against the water trough up the city. Sickly yellow lights went to and fro in the houses, and some of the passing cabs flaunted unextinguished lamps, and overhead the dawn was growing brighter, clear and steady and calm. He heard footsteps running to and fro in the rooms, and up and down stairs behind him. His landlady came to the door, loosely wrapped in dressing gown and shawl. Her husband followed, ejaculating. As my brother began to realize the import of all these things, he turned hastily to his own room, put all his available money, some £10 altogether, into his pockets, and went out again into the streets. That is the end of that chapter, and we will read more next week. I hope you are enjoying it. Again, tomorrow we are not doing Scared and Alone because there was a medical emergency, not in my household, but there was a medical emergency. So tomorrow I will be doing something, I don't know what yet, but 8 o'clock tomorrow night, I don't know what I'll do. It might be a Q&A, it might be painting, it might be personal stories, it might be readings. I don't know yet. I will post about it, what they are. Thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight. I hope you enjoy this story. I think it's quite good. If you are enjoying this and I bring you value, and only if it does not hurt you, a great way of supporting the channel is through my Patreon, The Gentleman Psychic, patreon.com/The Gentleman Psychic, or you can find me through my PayPal account, which is another great way. Also, if you can't, that's fine. I love you. I appreciate you. I'm so grateful that you are here. If you can, it helps out. If not, I appreciate you. And another great way of helping out are all the likes, the comments, and the shares. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And I hope wherever you are, whatever time it may be that you are listening to this, that you have a great evening, a great night, a great morning, or a great day. Take care. Till next time.